Hello to my Art 15 class. We are going to talk a little bit about using gouache. So here are the materials that I generally use when I use this medium. So I have a couple brushes. I have a round brush here and also a flat brush. And you don't necessarily have to have these types of brushes, but they're very versatile. The round brush is generally used for making any kind of marks. You could paint wide, you can paint thin, so it's very versatile. And the flat brush is similar except that it has an edge, and so we actually use this a lot for washes, but also because of that edge we can make some really intricate lines. And so I have the brushes, I have some painter's tape, I have my mixed media paper or watercolor paper if you have that, and I have my gouache tubes of paint. I have a jar of water, so just clear water there, and I also have some paper towel. And so what I normally do first is I like to mount my paper down onto the surface that I'm working on. So I actually have this masonite board that I use for drawing, but I use it for painting also. You can see some leftover marks from previous projects. So what I'm going to do with my painter's tape, I just like to take the edges down. So I'm going to do that rather quickly. I like to give myself about half an inch away from the border of the paper so that it'll keep the paper still, and that I have a little bit of an edge there without any marks. So it makes a really clean edge or a border if you like that. And the reason why I'm taping it down is that when I start applying the paint, you're going to notice that paper is thin for the most part. Even if you're using watercolor paper, there's a chance that it's going to buckle. In other words, if it's wet enough, it's going to start to crumple a little bit, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to work when the paper is not flat. Something that I would be wary of is I will not put the tape on I wouldn't push down too much, because there's a chance that when you remove the tape, it's going to tear from your paper. And this one is messed up. Cover the edge again, give myself about a half an inch of space from the edge. I notice there's a little bit of a space here. I'm just going to cover that. And I'm just going to paint a little bit just to demonstrate how gouache feels when you start to apply it on your paper, because it's not like watercolor, even though it's a type of watercolor. It's not like acrylic paint, and it's not like oil paint for those of you who have tried using that in the past. So I'm going to move my water aside. So I have my edges mounted there. there's one thing that I forgot to mention is I have a little palette paper. You don't have to use this. If you want to use a paper plate for a palette, that's fine. If you are really into your art, you probably have something like it already where you're going to have a surface to mix paint and to just basically put your pigment on before you actually put it on the paper. So I have my palette paper. I'm just gonna put it on the side here. And I actually like to tape this as well. So I have, let me move my camera down a little bit. So I have my palette paper here, just placed it a little bit lower from my paper. And what I'm gonna end up doing is, okay, so say that you have already a design in mind. I hope that you are using your sketchbook, that you have a design in mind when it comes to using the gouache. So I'm just going to use some shapes here. So I have this little guitar pick that's lying around. So you could tell that in my little studio space, it is my work office. It is the kids' music room. It's also the room where we store all of the clothes that they don't wear anymore. And so I'm gonna use this as a stencil just to make a little bit of a shape. And so one of the reasons why I like to assign the gouache paintings after the collages is that you want to use some of the things that you were using in the past into the present assignments. So after cutting out a lot of different shapes, you have something that you can use as a stencil when you create your design. So, and that is there just for an example. So I have my tubes of paint. I'm gonna put a little bit here, some pigment there. When it comes to gouache, it's very opaque, and that's really the benefit of this medium. Unlike watercolor, where it's very fluid and you're actually pushing around a lot of the water in the painting, but for gouache, it's relatively straightforward, and that's why we're actually using this opposed to another medium. So a little bit of the pigment, and I'm just going to apply the paint. And you'll notice right away that this medium is very chunky. It's gouache is actually a mixture of gum arabic, which is the binder in watercolor painting, but there's a little bit of chalk in it. That's why it is so opaque compared to watercolor. And so I can get as close as I can to the edge, but I don't even really have to worry about that. The thing about gouache is after it completely dries, you could paint on top of it and the colors are clean, and that they lay on top of each other very well. Okay, so it takes a little bit of work to get this pigment out there. So I'm actually just going to paint around it just so I can show you guys something. So you want that flatness, you want that opaque quality of this medium. Okay, when it comes to using gouache, students will right away notice that it doesn't flow as easy as other painting media. So you have to work it a little bit. And if it's too clumpy and you don't really like that, you can always add a little bit of the solvent, add a little bit of water, and just a little bit, because you want for the pigments to maintain its quality. If you put too much water, it's going to fade. Sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. And this is really a type of wet on dry application, where you're basically using a wet media on a dry surface. And so there's some pigment on here. Okay, and so say that you want to shift from this color to another. What I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to put my brush in my water. So I'm going to try to get as much of the pigment out as I can. If you want to use different brushes every single time you change colors, you can do that. Or you can just do this. Just rinse off your brush a little bit. So after I put it in the solvent or in the water, I just get my paper towel and just wipe off as much as I can. And again, you can always just switch brushes, or you can spend more time taking the pigment off so that you have a very clean, or you have a very fresh start when you start a new color. So I have that color. And so let's see. I'll try, that looks like the same. You're probably wondering, why am I using these colors? I don't use them enough, so that's why, you know what, for demo, yeah, I'll use them this time. Oh wow, okay, so this is a little bit darker. So you can paint on top of this while it's drying. I don't recommend that. I'd rather you just wait till it dries completely before you add another application. So I can actually use my blow dryer to make this dry even faster. And so yeah, gouache is very, it dries very fast. Okay, actually, let me show you guys with the flat brush. So I have the flat brush. You'll notice right away that it's really good for covering larger areas. You know, and I can paint over my lines. I think that with gouache, you can do that very confidently and still paint on top of it, and it won't really influence the color that is on top. If you paint over another color and it's still wet, you'll notice it'll start to blend a little bit. And that's okay if that's what you want. If you want to blend, you can blend on paper. But you have to do it in a way that you have to paint over the new color while the first color is still wet. So again, I don't have anything in mind right now. I'm just kind of playing around with the brushes and just painting. So this is very opaque compared to watercolor. If I was using watercolor, this would be more translucent. You'll be able to see through the color right away. And so I was talking a little bit about the lines, and you'll notice that with the flat brush, you can make lines. You want to be a little bit more detail oriented. It's a little bit of a risk. If you mess up, you just wait until it dries, and you can try it again. That's the cool thing about gouache. It's like acrylic. If you don't like what you're doing, you can always just cover it and paint, and then paint on top. Okay, so just some examples there. So when you're using this medium, there's a lot of different things that you could do with a brush. But generally you want something like this where it's just, covering an area. It's going to color a certain shape that you initially drew. Okay, so after I'm done with that color, again, I'm just gonna put it in the water, and I could actually put new water, but you don't really have to do that all the time. If you're transitioning from a really dark to a light, I probably would. So it's always good to have maybe 1 or 2 instances where you're refreshing that clean water. So I'm going to show you guys one more thing while this pigment dries a little bit. So I'm going to move my camera down a little bit. And if you want to mix your colors, you can paint one color while the other one is still drying. So then we call that a wet on a wet mix. But the easiest, most basic way to mix is just to do it on the side, on your palette. So I'm going to get a little bit of red, and I'm going to get some of the green and just put it together like that. So what I'm doing, I'm mixing complementary colors. I'm really flattening out the saturation of this red that I have. And if you know you're going to mix, you always have to do this ahead of time, and you have to make enough to cover the area that you intend to paint. And so here we have a very muted red, but because I'm using the complementary color, it's a little bit darker than the initial color that I had. So I'm going to paint the center here. Yes, I should have made up something instead of just winging it. Okay. So gouache is very opaque. It is the medium that comic artists used to use back in the day before they started to do everything digitally. Because gouache copies very well. In other words, if I were to make a copy of this work of a certain color, gouache maintains a lot of its initial color. So you can see how it is very opaque. And again, I don't have anything in my mind right now in terms of what I was going to paint about. I just wanted to play around with the color. So I have some of this mixed color here just to show you guys how this acts. Every painting medium has its own separate behaviors. Watercolor is more loose, very translucent. Gouache is not. it's more opaque. Okay, so gouache dries relatively flat, relatively quick. Always paint on the side first before you actually paint on the paper that you'll be doing your assignment on. So it's always good to have the paper, but also some scratch paper on the side. Okay, so experiment first before you start to use this on your project that you guys are going to be assigned. Okay, so that's about it. I just wanted to show you this. It's not pretty, but at least you got to see how I normally use this medium. I can show you guys some of the things that I made with this medium in another module. Okay, so good luck with it. Let me know if you have any questions.